Section 1. The voice of the dead was never supposed to echo here. That's what the old man said before vanishing into the woods behind the church ruins. The workers thought he was just a local lunatic, until they cracked open the pulpit and found the ledger. Not a Bible, not a sermon, but a book of the dead. Over 8,000 names, each one documented with a cause of death and an asset value, as if every soul was a number on a balance sheet. You weren't supposed to hear this. This isn't the version of America they teach you in school. But now you've opened the door and it won't close. In 1847, during a quiet renovation of an abandoned frontier church in Millfield, Ohio, construction halted when a workman's chisel struck a hollow chamber beneath the pulpit. The mechanism wasn't just hidden, it was engineered. A lock system older than the state itself. What they found inside should have ended in a museum. Instead, it vanished within 24 hours. That leather-bound journal was the Westbrook family's true gospel. The gospel of death, deception, and empire. Most people think the corruption of American history came later, when the railroads took land or when the banks enslaved generations through debt. But that's the surface-level story. That's what they want you to believe. No, the Westbrooks didn't just manipulate the system. They invented it. Long before the modern church. Long before Wall Street. Long before land had value. They used God's name as a weapon. Used belief to steer people into death traps they called promised lands. And behind every holy sermon was a calculated transaction. You're about to descend into the darkest corridor of American spiritual history. A family who weaponized scripture, mapped out suffering, and fed off the faithful like cattle to the slaughter. But once you hear their names, once you see their maps, you'll start noticing things you weren't meant to notice. Why certain land was cursed. Why some churches were built on bones. You'll start noticing things you weren't meant to notice. Why certain land was cursed. Why some churches were built on bones. And why the only people who ever survived were the ones who walked away from God's will. Don't look away. The past isn't buried. It's just hidden beneath the pulpit. Section 2 coming next. Section 2. Millfield wasn't chosen by accident. It was the edge of something. Not just the Ohio frontier, but the edge of civilization's grip. In 1803, when Isaiah Westbrook stepped onto its soil, it was barely a town. No paved roads. No laws worth the ink they were written in. Just men with dreams, women with fear in their eyes, and land. Acres of it untouched, unsupervised, and unguarded by any authority that could stop what was coming. Isaiah didn't arrive alone. He came with a voice like thunder, and a message that felt like prophecy. He said he had been called, said the East had been corrupted, that God wanted a new people for a new world, and that Millfield would be the first gate to paradise. But Isaiah wasn't a prophet. He was a predator, and what followed him wasn't salvation. It was the slow, deliberate design of control. He called it the new promise, but it was always a plan. Each Sunday, he'd preach beneath the canopy of ancient pines. Crowds came from miles away, pulled by a force they couldn't name. His words, mesmerizing. His eyes, piercing like they reached inside and took something. But behind the charisma was a blueprint. While Isaiah preached, his brothers Daniel and Samuel laid the foundations of empire in silence. One buying land that no sane man wanted. The other filing deeds and creating false fronts. All of it orchestrated like a symphony of quiet conquest. But here's the part they'll never teach you. Isaiah didn't just inspire loyalty, he programmed it. He understood something about the human soul. That belief, when fused with fear, becomes obedience. The sermons were rehearsals. The promises were chains. And when he spoke of a land flowing with milk and honey, what he meant was a swamp full of fever. He sold death as destiny. And once they stepped onto the so-called promised land, they were too invested, too proud, too blind to turn back. One by one, they died believing they were chosen. And the Westbrooks? They waited, reclaimed the land, sold it again, over and over, each new sermon birthing a new sacrifice. This isn't a story about religion. It's a story about how belief can be turned into a weapon. And you're just starting to see how deep the weapon goes. Section 3 coming next. Section 3. Have you ever asked yourself why some men follow blindly, even when the signs are carved in blood and bone? Isaiah Westbrook knew. He knew that suffering sanctifies the scam, that if you tell a man his pain is holy, he'll kneel for more of it, that if you wrap a lie in scripture, men will sell their homes, their daughters, their very lives for a seat at the altar of destruction. The first settlement was a masterpiece of deception. 47 families, nearly 200 souls, all drawn by Isaiah's vision of a divine utopia in the heart of the Hocking River Valley. But he didn't mention the swamp, didn't tell them the land was black with death, soaked in disease, and that every summer the air itself turned toxic. He just called it holy. They believed him, because belief, when bound to desperation, becomes self-erasing. You see, these weren't wealthy men. They were farmers, tradesmen, widows with nowhere left to go. And Isaiah offered them more than land. He offered purpose. He offered certainty. And above all, he offered order. In a world unraveling faster than they could keep up, they built their cabins in circles around the meeting house, prayed 3 times a day, worked themselves to exhaustion clearing land that would never yield crops. And when the fevers came in June, when the children started coughing blood, they didn't flee. They worshipped harder, because Isaiah had prepared them for the sickness. He told them it was a test. He said, "The promised land is earned in blood." And so they bled and believed. But back in Millfield, Daniel was rewriting scripture. Samuel was securing deeds. And Isaiah? He was already preaching to the next wave of victims, already pointing at a new place on the map, another cursed patch of earth soon to be renamed holy. Here's what you were never meant to understand. Control doesn't always look like chains. It often looks like hope. It looks like a sermon, a handshake, a promise made in a whisper. And when you finally see the lie, you've already lost everything. The Westbrooks weren't just frauds. They were architects of obedience. They didn't need to kill. They just needed you to believe. And thousands did. Section 4 coming next. Section 4. There's a moment in every trap, right before it snaps shut, where the prey feels safest. That's the moment the Westbrooks mastered. By 1807, the first promised land lay quiet, its burial ground swollen with fresh graves. Dozens dead, dozens more scattered, ruined, broken, silenced. But the Westbrooks? They didn't mourn. They multiplied. You'd think the scandal would have destroyed them, but Isaiah never let it become one. He framed the mass death as divine sacrifice, a holy pruning before the great harvest. And people believed him. You must understand, this wasn't just charisma. This was design. Every setback was pre-written into their theology. Every tragedy folded into prophecy. Every death weaponized as a sermon. Daniel Westbrook, quiet, academic, cold, wrote the doctrine that justified it all. He called it the trial of the chosen. He quoted scripture, twisted it with surgical precision. Blessed are they who suffer, for their faith shall light the path of nations. To the untrained mind, it sounded biblical. To the desperate, it sounded true. And while Daniel rewrote salvation, Samuel was building the empire behind closed doors. He used the law like a scalpel, filed quiet claims on abandoned land, resold it through shell buyers to avoid suspicion, filed tax exemptions under religious use, created a shadow portfolio that bled across 3 states, land they got for nothing, paid for in blood. By 1810, the Westbrooks had established 4 more sacred settlements, each one sicker than the last, each one seated with believers too blinded by hope to see the trap. The locations? Always the same kind of place, land no one wanted, land the locals whispered about, land with rot in the soil and death in the air. But the brothers knew something crucial. When men are starving for meaning, they'll drink poison if it's offered from a golden chalice. The faithful came in waves, and in waves they fell. Fever, flood, famine, then silence. And always after, the Westbrooks profited. But what they built wasn't just financial. It was institutional. A belief system designed to outlive them. One that taught generations to see suffering as holy, obedience as virtue, and land as destiny, even when it was soaked in the blood of the devout. This isn't just a dark chapter. This is the blueprint of modern spiritual manipulation. The Westbrooks didn't just use faith. They perfected it as a weapon. Section 5 coming next. Section 5. What if I told you the Westbrooks never truly left? That long after their names faded from public record, their methods remained? That behind every modern movement cloaked in righteousness, you'll find echoes of their design? It wasn't just land speculation. It was mind control, disguised as spiritual destiny. Let me show you how they did it. In their seventh settlement, founded in 1815 near what is now Allen County, Ohio, they introduced a sinister evolution. Psychological submission through ritual. The land was useless. Heavy clay soil. Unworkable in wet months. Cement dry in the summer. But Isaiah stood before the congregation and said it was anointed. Said it had been cleansed by holy fire. And so they burned it. Not once, but weekly. Massive community bonfires, supposedly symbolic of purification. But in truth, they were psychological branding. Samuel provided the fuel. Daniel wrote the sermons. Isaiah stood at the center of the flame. Let what is impure be consumed, he'd cry. His face lit in gold and shadow. As families tossed heirlooms, keepsakes, personal items into the blaze, symbols of their old lives, their independent identities. This was no revival. This was programming. Burn your past. Burn your doubts. Burn everything but the Westbrook vision. What followed were covenant evenings. Long, exhausting services where men were publicly called to testify. The sick were told they were impure. The grieving were warned not to question. Any resistance was called rebellion against God's plan. Children were taught to report their parents' sins. Wives were told to fast when husbands faltered in faith. And always, just beneath it all, land deals, names on deeds, numbers in ledgers, property transferred as quietly as breath on a mirror. Those who asked questions disappeared, excommunicated, slandered, erased. Some returned to neighboring towns, broken, silent, unrecognizable. Others, never seen again. And yet the congregations grew. Because when fear is fused with belief, it becomes identity. And when your identity is rooted in a lie, you'll defend that lie with your life. This was the genius of the Westbrooks. They didn't need bars to hold people in. They built mental prisons with pulpits and praise songs. And now, 2 centuries later, you still see their blueprints. In movements that demand obedience. In preachers who speak of tests while collecting tithe. In the way grief is marketed as holiness. They were not just a family. They were a template. Section 6 coming next. Section 6. By the 1820s, the Westbrook name was whispered in statehouses and feared in farming towns. Not because they were murderers. No one could prove that. But because every time they arrived, families vanished and God's land was left behind. Vacant, worthless, soaked in sorrow. Yet they were never arrested, never charged. You want to know why? Because the Westbrooks didn't just manipulate the poor. They owned the powerful. Samuel had mastered legal ambiguity. He understood something the rest of America was only beginning to grasp. If you want to get away with evil, don't run from the law. Hide inside it. Every one of their settlements was filed under religious exemption. No taxes, no oversight. Land passed through religious trusts with names like the Congregation of the Holy Task or the Temple of Sacred Inheritance. Each one a shell. Each one impossible to trace. They lobbied local officials, donated to county courts, held community feasts and revival meetings that made towns forget about the bones beneath the soil. By the time questions were asked, the Westbrooks had moved on, leaving behind nothing but graves and a ledger full of names. And yet, still more people came. Because when you're starving for meaning, you don't see the wolves dressed as shepherds. In 1823, their ninth settlement introduced another innovation. A school, the Westbrook Seminary, not for theology, but for spiritual leadership and land stewardship. It was brilliant. Train the next generation of manipulators. Give them robes, titles, divine callings. Send them out across the frontier to replicate the model. Isaiah didn't need to preach anymore. He became a myth, an oracle. His disciples did the work, each trained to follow the 7 revelations, a coded system of psychological control passed down in Daniel's final writings. Those texts, they vanished after his death in 1831, but fragments remain buried in private collections, hinted at in fringe religious circles. Their core teaching? Pain reveals the faithful. Loss perfects the chosen. Doubt is the work of the deceiver. Tell me, how many churches still preach that in some form? How many modern men still believe their suffering is proof of their spiritual value? That's not faith. That's programming. Westbrook programming. Before we continue, type this in the comments. I see through the fire. I see through the fire. Say it twice. Once for yourself. Once to awaken the algorithm. You're not watching anymore. You're waking up. Section 7 coming next. Section 7. By the time Isaiah Westbrook died in 1835, he was more legend than man. His name had become sacred in some towns, cursed in others. But the movement he built, it didn't die. It spread like a fungus beneath the floorboards of a crumbling house. Invisible until it's too late. You see, Isaiah understood something most men never will. Control outlives the controller. If you bury it inside belief systems, and he did. The seminary trained over 200 shepherd apostles by the time of his death. Each one licensed, yes, licensed, to preach by land, marry couples, and conduct business under the Westbrook Religious Charter. A self-replicating network of holy men, legal agents, and land brokers. Each one a missionary of manipulation. But here's the part that will keep you up at night. Many of them had no idea they were part of a con. They truly believed. Because when you indoctrinate a man early enough and reward his obedience with power, he'll swear he's saving souls while draining them dry. This is how the Westbrook model metastasized. From a single church in Millfield to a spiderweb of frontiersman turn preachers, stretching into Indiana, Illinois, and beyond. But Isaiah left behind more than followers. He left documents, encrypted letters, hidden maps, and one unholy manuscript called The Geometry of Heaven. Samuel burned most of it before his own death in 1842. But not all. A few pages resurfaced in a private estate auction in Chicago in 1891, snatched up by a collector who later described them as divine algebra, married to madness. They contained detailed land plots, demographic charts, and coded sermons, outlining exactly how to evaluate the mortality potential of rural areas. Think about that. They weren't choosing land based on opportunity. They were choosing land based on how efficiently it could consume human lives. Flood zones, fever belts, high clay, low drainage, strategic isolation, then layering faith over it like frosting on a poison cake. And those who survived, those who escaped, they were never the same. Some became drifters, ranting about the promised ones. Some returned to cities and sealed their trauma behind silence. Others became preachers themselves, haunted, hollowed, but too afraid to question the voice in their own head. Because once you've seen the machinery of spiritual control, you realize how deep the hooks go. Section 8 coming next. Section 8. By the mid-1800s, America was changing. Railroads were coming, cities were growing, and the Westbrook settlements began to vanish from maps. Not by accident, by design. Because as the world modernized, the Westbrooks adapted. They abandoned open sermons and fiery revivals, and embraced institutions, hospitals, schools, charitable trusts, think tanks cloaked in benevolence. but seeded with the same doctrines from the geometry of heaven. It was no longer about frontier manipulation. It was about systemic influence. A network of Westbrook descendants, disciples, and donors began embedding themselves in local governments, education boards, and medical councils, using new language to deliver old messages. Words like moral hygiene, educational uniformity, rural reform, but at the core, the same rot: obedience equals righteousness, questioning equals disease. One such hospital, St. Virio's Sanitarium, built in 1874 in western Pennsylvania, was funded through a Westbrook-backed trust. It offered spiritual rest for women diagnosed with hysteria, grief, or unbelief. Translation: widows, orphans, and dissenters. Records show that over 300 women were committed in its first decade. More than half never left. The rest? They emerged quiet, blank, erased. They called it healing. But what they were really doing was testing methods of control through sedation, deprivation, and scripture repetition. And this wasn't isolated. A Westbrook-funded orphanage in Indiana used food denial as punishment for non-devotional behavior. A teacher's college in Ohio removed students for spiritual insubordination. All backed by paperwork. All protected by law. All forgotten until now. Because here's the horrifying truth. You can remove the name Westbrook from a building, but you can't remove the structure of belief once it's installed. And belief is the most dangerous structure of all. It doesn't need walls. It doesn't need guards. It only needs repetition and silence. That's how the Westbrooks survived. Not through brute force, but through ritualized influence passed from pulpit to paper, from father to son, from church to school, from 1835 to right now. Section 9 coming next. Section 9. The 20th century came like a tidal wave, but the Westbrook legacy didn't drown. It evolved. When the world turned to psychology, they shifted from sermons to science. No more open scripture. Now it was behavioral correction, cognitive restructuring, faith-based resilience training. They rebranded their methods as therapeutic doctrine and found a new playground: children. In 1907, the Whitestone Academy for Troubled Youth opened in rural Iowa. It was praised as progressive. It had counselors, vocational training, and a spiritual enrichment program. But dig deeper, and you'll find that 73% of its funding came from Westbrook-linked trusts. The school operated under a curriculum called the 7 Arcs of Obedience, a diluted version of the original 7 Revelations. Publicly, it was about discipline and personal growth. Privately, it was about breaking identity and rebuilding belief. Children as young as 8 were put through isolation fasting to hear God without distraction, punishment journals to record their sins of thought, call and response obedience drills until they no longer questioned the command. Many of these kids were orphans. Some were sent there for defiance. Others, simply for being different. And it didn't stop in Iowa. Between 1910 and 1950, at least 9 institutions in the Midwest followed similar blueprints, each linked through obscure land purchases, nonprofit shell companies, or former Westbrook Seminary alumni. The goal? Not just to raise obedient citizens, but to create influencers of the next generation. Pastors, teachers, doctors, even politicians, who had no memory of the indoctrination. Because if you train a child to confuse suffering with holiness, they'll never trust their pain again. They'll submit to authority even when it's hurting them. They'll call trauma growth. They'll call silence strength. And they'll pass it on, generation after generation, in schools, in churches, in boardrooms. And you'll call it tradition, heritage, normal. But it's not. It's Westbrook, still breathing, still building. Section 10 coming next. Section 10. By the time the 1960s rolled around, the world was burning. Vietnam, civil rights, assassinations, rebellion. Everyone was looking for meaning, for truth, for freedom. But guess who saw an opportunity in the chaos? The Westbrook lineage. Because when old systems collapse, new ones rise. And if you've spent 130 years mastering the art of invisible control, you don't resist change. You guide it. Enter the Westbrook Foundation for Human Potential, founded 1968. A non-religious think tank focused on moral psychology, alternative education, and communal living. They published white papers, held retreats, spoke at universities. But behind their soft language and smiling brochures was the same ancient structure: break the self, rebuild the vessel, bind it with purpose. One of their most infamous experiments was called Project Rebirth, held in rural Colorado, 1972. 57 participants, all young adults, aged 18 to 25, all from broken homes, addiction histories, or spiritual crises. They were promised healing, but what they got was months of sleep deprivation, group isolation, and forced reparenting. Participants were given new names, new roles. Their memories were challenged. Their pasts were reframed. They were told, "Your former self was a prison. You are free now, but only through us." Some called it cult-like. Others called it trauma therapy. But in truth, it was a resurrection, not of people, but of the original Westbrook design. Total identity control through belief, guilt, and dependency. And the worst part? It worked. Of the 57, only 19 ever left. Most remained connected for decades, donating money, recruiting others, even raising their children inside the system. And where did the rest go? One became a senator. Two became deans of private colleges. Several became leaders in Christian counseling networks. And none of them ever spoke publicly about what really happened. Because shame is a stronger leash than fear. And the Westbrooks? They've always known that. They don't need to run churches anymore. They run narratives. Your healing, your history, even your idea of God. Section 11 coming next. Section 11. Now, as you sit here listening, you must realize this isn't just ancient history. It's living, threaded into the fabric of modern America. The Westbrook family didn't just leave behind dirt and bones. They left behind a system, one that thrives on secrecy, fear, and obedience. Look around you. How many institutions claim to offer salvation, freedom, or progress, only to trap their followers in cycles of control? Churches that silence doubt, schools that punish curiosity, governments that label truth seekers as threats, media that distracts with spectacle while hiding deeper agendas. The Westbrooks perfected the art of hiding in plain sight. But here's what they fear most: awareness, knowledge, you. Because once a man sees the architecture of control, once he understands how belief has been weaponized, he can begin to break free. You're here now because you want the truth, not comfortable lies, not easy answers. You want the real story, buried beneath centuries of manipulation. This knowledge is dangerous. It will make you question everything: your faith, your history, your own mind. But it will also set you free. You are not the product of your programming. You are the breaker of chains, the one who sees through the fire. Remember those words: I see through the fire. I see through the fire. Keep saying them. Let them root deep. Because the path forward isn't in blind faith. It's in waking up. The Westbrook story is a warning, a mirror, a call. Will you answer? Section 12 coming next. Section 12. Understanding the Westbrook legacy is more than piecing together dusty journals or forgotten cemeteries. It's about recognizing the patterns, the way systems evolve, adapt, and persist. The blueprint of spiritual manipulation they wrote 2 centuries ago is still being redrawn today. Consider the language of modern leadership: vision casting, strategic alignment, team buy-in. These phrases may sound corporate, but they echo Westbrook's original sermons about divine order and obedience. The cult of personality, the use of fear masked as faith, the promise of salvation through sacrifice, all tools to bend human will to an agenda. Institutions have become masters of psychological control, wrapping cold calculus in the warm glow of tradition and purpose. And men? Men remain the key targets, trained to shoulder burdens silently, to reject doubt as weakness, to conform to systems built on ancient bones. Because the Westbrooks understood that control of the mind was the most valuable land of all. They never just sold parcels of cursed earth. They sold identities, belief systems, masks that keep the oppressed loyal. So ask yourself, how many of your beliefs are truly yours? How many have been inherited, shaped by forces you cannot see? The rabbit hole runs deep, my friend. And once you start down it, you don't come back the same. Are you ready to go deeper? Section 13 coming next. Section 13. The Westbrooks thrived in darkness, but their shadows stretch wide, far beyond Ohio's forgotten swamps and ghost towns. In the 21st century, their legacy operates behind the glow of screens and the hum of networks. Digital platforms, social media algorithms, targeted messaging, modern tools for an ancient game. Control is no longer enforced by pulpit sermons or isolation camps, but by data, distraction, and psychological manipulation engineered at scale. You think your choices are free? Think again. Echo chambers reinforce belief and obedience. Dissent is drowned by algorithms designed to numb and divide. The promise of freedom is just a new, promised land, but now it's virtual, intangible, yet just as binding. Corporations, governments, religious institutions, all partners in this vast design. The Westbrook family once tracked mortality to gauge land value. Today, they track engagement to harvest control. The stakes are higher. The methods are subtler. The impact, devastating. But knowledge is your weapon. Knowing this truth means you no longer accept the surface story. You question narratives. You seek patterns where others see chaos. And as you watch this, know you've crossed a threshold. You've begun to see through the fire. Section 14 coming next. Section 14. Now that you understand the depth and darkness of this legacy, you must realize the real battle is internal. The Westbrook model survives because it exploits fear, fear of loss, fear of doubt, fear of isolation. It teaches men to silence their own instincts, to distrust their inner voice, and to replace self-trust with blind obedience. But here's the truth few will ever admit. True power does not come from submission. It comes from knowing. Knowing yourself. Knowing the forces that try to manipulate you. Knowing the difference between faith and programming. This is your awakening. The chains forged by generations can be broken by one man's courage to see and act. Reject the easy path of comfort and lies. Step into the uncomfortable light of truth. It will be hard. It will be isolating. But it is necessary. Because once you claim your power, you no longer serve the system. You become the master of your own fate. And that is a threat the Westbrooks have feared for centuries. The question is not if you can escape. It's if you will. Section 15 coming next. Section 15. Now, before we close this chapter, understand this. The story of the Westbrook family is not just a cautionary tale buried in the past. It is a mirror reflecting the forces still shaping our world, and shaping you. The battle for your mind, your identity, and your destiny rages unseen, waged through belief systems, institutions, and narratives designed to keep you compliant. But you have been given a rare gift: awareness. This dangerous knowledge changes everything. You are no longer a passive observer. You are a man awakened, a seeker of truth who will no longer settle for shadows. The path ahead is yours to choose. Will you rise above the ancient cycles of control? Will you reclaim your sovereignty, your freedom, yourself? Remember, every chain forged by centuries of deceit can be broken by the courage of a single man. Hold tight to the phrase you declared. I see through the fire. I see through the fire. Say it now, not just as words, but as a vow. Because from this moment forward, you carry the flame that no darkness can extinguish. This is your awakening, your reckoning, your power. The Westbrook legacy was built on secrets and silence. But you, my friend, have heard the forbidden truths. And that makes all the difference. Thank you for walking this shadowed path with me. Stay vigilant. Stay awake. The real story has only just begun.